When it comes to the subject of the mark of the beast, many modern scholars have questioned whether or not a modern civilized world would ever implement uncivilized means of population control in the 21st century. And certainly we would never segregate or mark men and women and boys and girls with some type of visible mark on their head. Surely that's all forgotten in dark history. But I wanted to just for a moment, because we live in a day and an age in which our young people are being raised in schools where history books have been erased, replaced, rewritten, to give you just a brief history lesson on marking human flesh. Many in the 21st century have forgotten our long, brutal history of marking and branding human flesh for political and religious and ideological purposes. When the mark of the beast, by the way, soon arrives, it will not be the first time that a wicked group of political despots have segregated people and marked them for inhumane treatment, unspeakable, barbaric tortures that cannot be uttered in the presence of children, and even marked them for death. Brands and marks have been used throughout human history. These brands were usually applied in a very, very visible part of the body so that all could see. Oftentimes in history, it was on the face, even on the forehead. And most commonly, it was branded upon human flesh with the primitive use of a hot branding iron. The purpose of branding and marking throughout history was twofold. Number one, it was to combine this incredible punishment upon people, but not only punishment, but public humiliation, to bring terror and submissive fear upon all of the public that witnessed it. The intense pain of sensitive nerve endings being seared, and the sound and the smell of burning flesh would reduce even the most rugged of men to piercing screams and sometimes emotional breakdown. The ancient Romans branded the Colosseum gladiators, used for grotesque sport, on their foreheads as they entered with grotesque and visible identification. In the Acts of Sharble, which I don't expect most to understand that, but it's a text from the 5th century where we read of the various tortures that were inflicted upon Christians and the followers of Christ. Countless numbers of Christians were publicly branded between the eyes and on their cheeks for refusing to offer sacrifices to the Roman emperor. In the 16th century, the German Anabaptists were branded with a cross on their foreheads for refusing to recant their faith and join and pledge their allegiance to the Roman Catholic Church. In the North American colonial settlements of the 17th and early 18th centuries, branding was a common punishment, even in our own country, for people that were found guilty of various crimes. The type of branding varied depending upon the crime. Men and women that were oftentimes convicted or caught in the act of adultery were stripped bare-chested and their flesh branded with a large capital A. D for drunkenness, B for blasphemy or burglary, T on the hands of a thief, SL on the cheek for those that had been convicted of seditious libel, R on the shoulder for rogues or vagabonds, and F on the cheek for those who were convicted of forgery. In the Canadian military prisons were branded with D for desertion, BC for bad character, and usually once they received a branding publicly, they then ended up in some type of penal colony. The Jews were marked by the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s. And time will not permit me to give you an exhaustive lesson on public branding and marking humanity. And I'm not here, listen carefully, I don't share these dark historic reminders to inspire fear in the audience, but rather I share them with you to remind you of the words of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah, the prophet of the Old Testament, oftentimes called the weeping prophet, said in Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 9, the human heart is the most deceitful of all things and desperately wicked. Who really knows how bad it is? And from Jeremiah's words in the Holy Bible, this is what I want you to grasp. And if you're taking notes, make sure you understand it. A wicked heart in a wicked man does not change, regardless of the century, regardless of the culture, or regardless of the civilization. The problem is not education. The problem is not advancement of society. The problem is sin, and the answer is Jesus. If you believe it and receive it, give the Lord a mighty hand of praise. So for those of you who perhaps would like to believe in our civilized 21st century that in our country or other places of the world that people in power will not resort to such barbaric things, you, my friend, need to take another history class. Number one, if you're taking notes, what is the mark of the beast? The Bible states that the mark of the beast is a mark, a literal mark, that will be placed on a person's forehead or upon their right hand during the Great Tribulation period. We find that in Revelation chapter 13 and verse 16, where the Bible, referring to the Antichrist or the beast, it said he required everyone, small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be given a mark on the right hand or on the forehead. And in the original Greek, that means on the right hand or on the forehead. There is no getting around this. There is no other explanation for this. There is no trying to soften this. The Antichrist in that final political reign of evil before the second coming of Jesus Christ, which will take place at the end of the Great Tribulation, it is going to be a literal mark. The purpose of the mark is twofold. First, it is a mandated, cashless economic system that will be brutally and severely enforced. Secondly, it is a permanent and visible sign that you have pledged your total allegiance to global control of this man called the Antichrist and have willingly, and I emphasize willingly, have received his mark of ownership and control. The Greek New Testament uses the word for mark or sign 8 times, and Revelation contains 7 of those references. All 7 refer to the mark of the beast. The word mark in Greek means a mark or stamp engraved, etched, branded, cut, or imprinted. And I've read multiple scholars on this subject throughout the years, and it seems that the weight of scholarship rests upon something literal and something visible. The one thing, if you're taking notes, that I want you to be sure that you understand, it is a literal, visible mark of identification.